What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV, aka Darth Apocalypse. All right, so before I get into this video, shout out to Quindrick for showing love once again. $10 donation to the channel via the Cash App. Truly appreciate you. So recently, we saw the retirement of Russell Westbrook, and earlier this year, Chris Paul. And while I do believe that these guys are all top 5, top 10 all time point guards, I do sometimes think that when you listen to a lot of sports media, they often fall victim to recency bias. 20 years ago, you would have saw names like Kidd, Peyton, arguably top 5. If you go back further, you would see names like Nate Tiny Archibald. These guys are dropping off the list. I don't even see Walt Clyde Frazier on these lists anymore. They do top 10 because they don't know who these players are, and they seem to think that the NBA only started in 1980 and 1990. 20 years from now, they're going to start completely ignoring the 90s and start only including the 2000s. And we're going to feel slighted. I still believe that when you look at his resume, Bob Cousy should still be a top 5 to 6 point guard in the NBA as far as all time. I understand people say, look, man, his skills are primitive compared to today, and he didn't have a left hand, and he only shot 38% from the field for his career. It's black and white footage. He's going up against primitive cavemen out there on the court. One thing I'll say about Bob Cousy. Bob Pettit is another guy we need to keep, giving him his flowers while he's still here. Bob Cousy was a pioneer and is still a pioneer when it comes to the point guard position. He was the first superstar point guard. Bob Cousy's 98 years old. 98 years old. I believe he is the longest lived. I got to think about this before I go forward, but Bob Cousy might just be the longest lived all-star / superstar athlete in North American history. I'm trying to think of somebody else who's lived longer, and I'm rooting for him to reach 100. But he's 98 years old. He's the oldest member of the Hall of Fame. And I think that he's become criminally underrated. Not overrated, underrated. Because before Bill Russell even joined the Boston Celtics, Bob Cousy was holding it down for Boston. Bob Cousy was drafted by the Tri-Cities Blackhawks back in 1950. That franchise would ultimately become the Atlanta Hawks as we know them today. He didn't report to the Tri-Cities Blackhawks. They waived him. He refused to report to them, and they waived his rights, I guess. And he was ultimately picked up by the Boston Celtics. And he helped to, along with Bill Sharman, he helped to keep Boston as, even though they struggled with defense and their rebounding, which is why Bill Russell was such a great fit for this franchise when he was drafted. but despite their deficiencies on defense and in their front court, he helped to keep this team a viable playoff team for many, many years. He was, like I said, he was a superstar. We hadn't seen anybody up to that point in time be able to showcase such brilliant wizardry on the floor as far as playmaking and ball handling. So much so that he was called the Houdini of the hardwood. Now people can say, look, those moves look so primitive compared to today. Gotta understand that when he played, you still weren't allowed to do certain things with the basketball. Now they did allow Cousy to do some things that other players weren't really technically allowed to do. But as I've always said, the NBA is still a business. And if your most marketable star in the 1950s outside of George Mikan and perhaps Bob Pettit is a wizard with the basketball, they're going to have to let him be able to do certain things that the rule book said he shouldn't be able to do. But let's be honest, a lot of Bob Cousy's game, if you watch it on those old black and white films, it looks a little urbanish. And that's because when he was growing up as a poor youth in the 1930s and into 1940s, he lived in a neighborhood that was very ethnically mixed. I think Bob Cousy was French. He was the son of French immigrants. His father served in World War I in France. I forget the ethnicity of the mother. She might have been French too. Bob Cousy spoke French until he went to grade school. And then he picked up English. But when he grew up in the ghetto. And it's funny how people say, "Oh, this guy's ghetto, that guy's ghetto." Now understanding that their grandparents and great grandparents lived in the slums and ghettos too, right? But Bob Cousy grew up playing with Jewish kids and Irish kids and black kids, and that instilled in him, because he had strong friendships with people of different races and cultures and religions. It instilled in him a very strong anti-racist mindset, to the point where he didn't tolerate that shit. When, as he got older, and in particular playing, if he was ever in the South or in Boston, he saw it. Although he was still not aware of the death in which Bill Russell and ultimately some of his other black teammates, such as Casey Jones, had to deal with. Zach Sanders had to deal with racism. He was still not aware of how prominent the problem was. So much so, I remember it was an interview that he did some years ago. I think it might have been in the 90s, where he broke down and cried because he said, "I wish I could have vocalized more about, what Bill Russell was going through," because he thought Bill was just moody, just mean. And he didn't know that Bill Russell was internalizing a lot of pain and anger that he was transferring onto the basketball court and using that rage in a more positive manner, which was destroying the opposition with his defense, rebounding, and high basketball IQ and plays out there on the court, which ultimately led to 11 championships. But Bob Cousy himself won many championships. When you look at his resume, 6-time NBA champion. He was the league MVP in 1956-57, which I remind you was Bill Russell's rookie year. 13-time All-Star, 2-time NBA All-Star Game MVP, 10-time All-NBA first team, 2 times All-NBA second team. There was no All-NBA third team when Bob Cousy played. They didn't introduce that to the NBA until, I think, 1989. He led the NBA in assists 8 times. 8 times, which I think is second most, only to John Stockton. Bob Cousy, is a member of the 25th, 35th, 50th, and 75th anniversary teams as far as NBA history is concerned. And he is one of only two members of the 25th anniversary team that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, let me think about this. 25th. So that would be 1971. I believe he's one of only two people still alive from the inaugural 25th anniversary team, the other being Bob Pettit. Number 14 retired by the Boston Celtics. He won the NCAA championship in 1947, consensus first team All-American 1950, second team All-American, AP, UPI, Look 1949, third team All-American, AP 1948. Number 17 retired by the Holy Cross Crusaders. And Cousy won the Presidential Medal of Freedom back in 2019, presented to him by Donald Trump. For his career, he scored 16,960 points or 18.4 points per game. So he was an underrated scorer. Sometimes people get the impression that Cousy just passed and passed and passed, but he could score. As a matter of fact, he once held the record for most points in a playoff game, which was 50. And that 50 was the most, I think, in a playoff game for a Boston Celtic until I think it was broken by John Havlicek when he scored 54, which I think was 1973, might have been. And I think he still holds the record for most free throws made in a playoff game, 30 in that 50-point game. He grabbed 4,786 rebounds, 5.2 rebounds per game, and dished out 6,955 assists, 7.5 assists per game. And it's to be noted that when Cousy played, it was a lot more, it wasn't as easy to get assists. The basket had to lead directly to, the pass had to lead directly to a score. The guy got the ball, gathered, self dribbled once, shot. That's not considered an assist in Cousy's time. Today it's considered an assist. So if Cousy had almost 7,000 assists back then, by today's loose standards, he would probably had 9,000. About the 38% shooting percentage, you have to look at a multitude of factors when it comes to that. The compact schedule, players were a lot more fatigued back then. The shot selection was not very good. Back then, players were generally expected in 1950 to take the first available shot, 50s into the 60s. Oftentimes, that was a long two. And as we know, long twos are statistically the least efficient shots you can take on the floor, usually. And also, players weren't as advanced in shooting ability back then. You had some natural shooters, but even with a guy like Bill Sharman, he shot 41% from the field for his career. It wasn't as easy when you have big trees down low, like Chamberlain and Bellamy and Johnny Red Kerr and Bill Russell. When you got all these guys down low, and you're a jump shooter, you're relegated to shooting outside perimeter shots. So that had a lot to do with it. I think today's game, Cousy would have a much higher field goal percentage. I think he would have shot probably, instead of 38%, I think he'd be more around 45%. But I think he'd be a good shooter. I think he would be like 45% from the field, maybe 38% from three, 81% from the line. It'd be something like that, I guess. I'm just guessing. I could be wrong. I think he was a good shooter. Usually a good indicator about how good a shooter a guy is, you could free throw percentage. look at the free throw percentage and you listen to what some of the scouts would say about them shooting. I still remember, I can't end this video out saying this about Cousy. That scene on Blue Chips when he, made all those damn free throws. That was real. Uh, he just could not miss, even when he, what I'm saying, he just kept on shooting and kept on making them. He didn't have to do any cutaways. He just kept nailing them. And Cousy was such a beloved basketball player when he retired that President Kennedy wired him after he retired when they had the so-called Boston Tier Party. That's what it's called when he retired in that last game. But anyway, Cousy, one of the greats, came back and played a few games as he was a head coach in 1969-70 for the Cincinnati Royals, which I believe was the last season Oscar Robertson was there. He said at the time that he could see that there was an advancement in the point guard position from when he played. He said these guys were bigger, stronger, and more skilled. So he was a guy that gave credit when credit was due. And I'm going to tell you guys, look at something too. When you get a chance, look at the old timers game from the late 80s. I think it was from 1987 or 88, right? Check out Cousy in this old timers game during the All-Star break. I think they discontinued the old timers game, I think in the early 90s due to legal reasons, because I think players were starting to get hurt and they didn't want to be subjugated to any lawsuits or a guy having a heart attack. For instance, like I think the Pete Maravich thing when he died kind of shook them a little bit. But look at how hard those guys were playing in these old timers games in the 80s on YouTube. Look how hard these guys are playing. Bob Cousy was 58 years old in that game. And look how hard he's playing in a game that he's not really getting paid. I don't know if they got paid for that shit. Maybe. What? 50,000? 25? Well, I doubt that back then. Maybe what? 10,000 maybe? Look how hard he was playing in that old timers game in 1988 versus how hard these guys who are getting paid millions today. And you'll see why that we need to respect these old timers more. But salute to Bob Cousy, teach against